Okay, I think we'll make a start. Welcome to the April Executive Scrutiny Board meeting. Do we have any apologies over and above Councillor Pegg and Councillor Carr? Possibly Councillor Evans, but
Councillor Cooper.
We'll wait to see if he arrives. Sorry.
Councillor Cooper. Chair.
Councillor
Cooper.
Councillor Cooper as well. Okay, so that's Cooper, Pegg, Evans and Carr. Right, we'll make a start. I have no late items to be introduced. Any declarations of interest? If there aren't any, you've had the minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of March. Thank you, Lucy. You've had also had the forward plan, item 5. Is there anything that anybody wishes to raise from that? If not, moving on to item 6, Council Cabinet responses to scrutiny recommendations. They are also attached. Moving on to 7, Performance Plan, also attached. Lucy.
Yeah, just regarding the performance plan, we agreed sometime last autumn, it seems a long time ago now, to look at the COVID situation and to do a review on that early this year. I think early this year is rushing past rapidly, and it's probably going to be middle of this year before we get that done. I think it's still important. I was hearing only yesterday that across the country there are something like 20,000 people in hospital with COVID at the moment. It's not gone away, and it's obviously drawing down particularly NHS services and making it difficult with a number of absences as well. So I think there's still a review needed. We just need to schedule it.
I'll ask for an update. Stephen and then Alison.
Thank you, Chair. I'm aware that my colleagues are working on something, possibly a joint between all the boards, something to looking at the whole COVID situation. So I'll feed that back to my colleagues.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. So Stephen's going to feed that back, Lucy. Okay.
Thank you.
Alison?
Just to inform or remind everyone that the Adults and Health Scrutiny Board has had COVID as a standing item at every meeting throughout the year and does receive regular updates. And we have a meeting on the 18th of April. I'm not sure if we probably won't receive that report entirely there, but it is something that's been completely on the radar throughout the year. So it hasn't been something that hasn't been addressed by a scrutiny committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Moving on to the main Council Cabinet now, on to item 9, Children's Accommodation Strategy, delivery of small children's residential homes. Who's taking us through?
Chair,
Sorry, yep.
I think there are a couple of points, aren't there, before this?
Okay. Sorry, in terms of item 7. Yeah, okay. Is there anything you wish to raise on?
Yeah, on both of these, Chair, both the one regarding looked after children and also the one on the virtual school. I thought they were both useful, and particularly on the virtual school, I think that's a useful reminder that we as corporate parents need to think about the schooling of and how performance is happening for the young people in the council's care. Regarding the early help, I would like to propose that we thank the Scrutiny Review Board for their report, looking at the positive impact that the early help team has had, and to recommend to Cabinet to keep a close eye on its ongoing impact in light of the reduction in funding, because they're taking a cut to that, but the report is really positive about the impact they've had over the last year or so.
Do you want to make a recommendation then, Lucy?
So yeah, my recommendation would be I think the minute would be to thank the Children and Young People Scrutiny Review Board for the report of the positive impact of the early help team, and to recommend to Cabinet to keep a close eye on its ongoing impact in light of the reduction in funding.
Okay. Do we have a seconder for that at all?
I fully support what Councillor Kerr is saying. I'm not quite sure of the need for the recommendation, Councillor Kerr, just because we know that is the ongoing situation, and we know that is happening, and we know that is constantly what the service is doing. So I don't feel, it's not that I'm against what you said, I just don't feel compelled. I don't see it as a recommendation as such, but thank you.
So I've not spoken to the chair of the Scrutiny Board about this, but for the board to send this forward to Cabinet, it's clearly something that they are concerned about. Otherwise, they wouldn't have forwarded it in this direction to Cabinet. And having read the report, or at least having read the minute, the thing that strikes me as being of note is the good work that the team is doing and the concern that there has been a budget cut this year. And therefore, the message to me is that we need to be watching closely that we continue to have a well-performing service despite the service cuts.
Can I just say, I think that is encapsulated in the final page. The board resolved to urge Cabinet to be vigilant that the reduction in scope and capacity of the early help team does not lead to a consequent budgetary pressure in the future. The board urged Cabinet to ensure the funding and sustainability of the early help team. So I think, isn't that encapsulating what you're suggesting, well, Lucy?
It does, but I was thinking that we as the...
Do you just want to endorse what they're saying?
I wanted to endorse what they're saying, but okay. So we can just endorse it.
Let's just endorse it, Lucy, and let's move on.
That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll endorse it. Thank you. Thank you. Anything else, Lucy?
No.
Thank you. On that one, anyway. Right. Moving on. Item 9. Children's Accommodation Strategy. Gamal.
Thank you, Chair. I'll draw out headlines for the report. So this report links to the Council's Children Accommodation Strategy and specifically around the delivery of small children's residential homes. So in terms of the purpose, this report seeks approval to proceed with a compliant procurement process to secure an external service provider to refurbish 2 properties and in addition to manage and operate the 2 new smaller children residential homes on behalf of the Council. And this is part of the wider strategic partnerships being developed with service providers by the Council as part of the Children's Accommodation Strategy. In the main body of the report, 2 properties have already been sourced and are available. 2 placements have already been identified in terms of 14 to 16-year-olds who would move into these solo placements. 4 existing 4 children's residential homes are currently operational with 20 placements, and these 2 properties will provide a further 2 placements for young people with complex needs. And in terms of future-proofing this concept, the procurement process will initially be for 2 properties with an option to include a further 4 and a total of 6 in due course. And Chair, the procurement process will start shortly. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Gamal. Any questions of Gamal? Lucy.
Thank you, Chair. It's not sure there's so much questions as points that I hope will be included as we go through the process from here. In that I would hope that the homes that we are identifying are going to be within the Derby urban area and not further afield. You know, I know there's a figure here given for the proportion of young people who are within 20 miles of the city. But 20 miles of the city seems to be quite a long way, and I would hope that within our urban area is where these properties are going to be. And I think we ought to facilitate, enable within that contract that councillors are able to go and make visits in the same way as we do as corporate parents to properties that we are responsible for directly, just to give another line of oversight as to how those the operations are going. There's a comment here in terms of the climate awareness here, and I would hope that we are looking at building improvements to enable zero carbon ready for 2035 and not just current building standards, which is what later on in the report we're talking about for Infinity Village. And if we're in charge of this, then we should be looking at improvements to that standard, because then we won't need to do improvements in the next 10 years to be able to achieve that standard in future. This is the time we ought to be doing it. And I would put forward a recommendation if that's what people agree with me. And I have got one question, which is, have we looked into why we are unable to find staff for children's homes, small children's homes like this, when other providers are somehow able to? What is it that's wrong with our HR systems, our contracts, our something that means that we are unable to recruit? Because if we could solve that problem, then we might not be, this would be a different scenario we'd be looking at.
Okay, Gamal, we've got comments from Lucy there for you to respond to, and also the question, if you don't mind, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Just picking up the comments firstly, in terms of visiting, yes, absolutely fine. It will be identical to existing children's homes. We'll capture that within the contract. In terms of the design of these properties, these will be domestic properties like you and I live in, because the aim is to have a solo placement children's home, and therefore we will do what we can in terms of that domestic design, in terms of sustainability features that are being outlined in relation to that. The point on staffing, more generally, there is a sufficiency issue, not just for councils, for private providers as well. And that's why there's a national children's services review underway. And one of the aspects being considered was the Competition Markets Authority are looking into the sufficiency aspect, including, I guess, recruitment in that sort of space. So councils and providers are all struggling with a shortfall of placements, but in terms a national drive around professional development and a recruitment process for social workers and people to be operating children's homes, including the Competition Market Authority have made a whole set of recommendations which the government is considering, which includes Ofsted registration processes around managers and other aspects which may help to try and reshape the position. But there is always going to be a challenge on trying to recruit because of a lack of sufficiency, and we are doing all we can as a council, as providers are as well. I don't know if I've answered all the questions, and if I've missed one, Chair, happy to pick that up.
That's right. Thank you, Gamal. Lucy.
The one missed was to make sure that these properties are going to be within the Derby urban area.
Yeah, Lucy's concerned that 20 miles would take us to the side of Nottingham.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The aim will be to, certainly the two that have been identified in this report are within the curtilage of Derby City, and our aim would be to work with providers to have other properties. I can't absolutely say, because that journey needs to continue, but our aim is to have placements local, and I guess it would be fair to say the thinking in the children's accommodation strategy is to have property identified in Derby, either the council owns that could be used for these placements or that providers have within the curtilage.
Thank you very much. Okay. Right. If there's no more on item 9, moving on to item 10, Schools Capital Programme. Gamal, I guess this is you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the annual Schools Capital Programme, maintenance programme for 22-23. The Department for Education has now confirmed £3.1 million maintenance funding for the council's maintained schools. Those projects are now being prioritised in terms of schools with condition needs. The report sets out the criteria that colleagues in property services and ourselves use. The appendix outlines the proposed projects. A couple of other things that are on there in terms of updating the capital programme now that the full Section 106 funding has been secured for the new school proposed at the Snellsmore Grange housing development, and also the report outlines other Section 106 funding being applied to Noel Baker Academy, And then the final point are transactional points in relation to the scheme being progressed in relation to Landau Forte. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Gamal. Any questions? Alison.
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment, really, just to seek Gamal's reassurance that any significant maintenance work that takes place from this funding or from other funding from now on looks very much bravely to the future rather than just accepting current standards or looking to the past in terms of things like insulation, heating, etc. Because we know that we're in a energy cost crisis at the moment, and we can all hope that costs come down, but we also know that there's the climate impact to consider. So we really have to be future thinking, really, and forward thinking, sorry, in terms of the work that's done. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Okay, any further comments? Lucy?
Excuse me, Chair. Councillor Kerr, can you activate your microphone?
Oh, sorry.
If you could
Sorry.
begin that again,
It's
please.
been off all the time?
Yes.
Oh,
I've just
sorry, Chair.
noticed
Do you want
on
me to start
the...
again?
please.
So, following on from the previous comment, I was pleased that the first of the projects referred to being zero carbon ready, and that's really positive. But then other ones go on to talk about installing of gas boilers, which is not going to be zero carbon by 2035. And most of those boilers, I think, are going to be lasting 15 years plus. So we should be looking at that now and not having to renew them later on. So therefore, I was going to suggest that we put a recommendation to Cabinet that we should ask all governing bodies and Academy Trust, as appropriate, to consider how their schools can become zero carbon by 2035, including developing plans for their buildings, travel and other activities. And while people think about that, I'd also had a question regarding the new school, and I'm sure I've read that the government is now allowing councils to effectively become their own academy. And has this been considered as, if that's right, has that been considered as a solution for Snelsmore Grange?
Okay, do you want to respond, Gamal, to that? And then you come back to us, Lucy, with your possible recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking the second bit up first. So the competition process for a sponsor to run the new school is already underway, and that is already progressing. In terms of any changes around who operates, the white paper is currently out for consultation. So at this moment in time, I'm not aware of specific guidance to the council in relation to an active proposal like Snelsmore. For all intents and purposes, that is following the current legislation, which requires a sponsor, and then the DfE will take a decision on that sponsor. That competition process is underway, Chair. The point on climate implications, absolutely. So in terms of, as 9.1 in the report outlines, where it is possible to design and future-proof towards net zero carbon goals, then the council will seek to do that. Of course, the challenges are, some of these are maintenance schemes in very old and dated buildings, but those aspirations still remains there. And of course, in terms of any new build like Snelsmore, yes, environmental features and sustainability and carbon neutral needs to be designed in.
Thank you, Gamal. Lucy, do you have a recommendation?
What I've sketched out, Chair, is to say, recommend that Cabinet ask all governing bodies, perhaps I should say school governing bodies, and academy trusts as appropriate to consider how their schools can become zero carbon by 2035, including developing plans for their buildings, travel and other activities.
Okay, do I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you. Does anybody wishes to speak against Lucy's recommendation? If not, then I'll go to the vote. Those in favour, please indicate.
3 in favour, Chair.
Those against? Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, moving on to item 11, developing the Derby City tourism offer. Claire, is that your colleague?
Hello, Chair. So, yes, this report is about the tourism offer in Derby, and the reason that we're considering it at this point and have brought a report is because of 2 emerging opportunities. One of those is our own ambitions in the city to help the city and the city businesses to recover post-COVID by attracting more visitors to the city. And this need for more visitors has been widely recognised in the City Council plan and the UK City of Culture bid. And the second factor is the National Dubois Review, which was commissioned in 21 by the DCMS Secretary of State and the Tourism Minister to try and make some sense of the tourism landscape. There are currently several hundred DMOs, destination management organisations or tourist boards across the country. And the review suggests that there is a 3-tier approach applied in future. And this would mean that only the first 2 tiers are recognised as proper tourist boards, with opportunity to work with Visit Britain on tourism campaigns and the possible opportunity in the future to be able to access funding. So we really needed to understand how the city's tourism offer needed to develop in order to address both of these issues and be able to assist the city through increased visitors. So we commissioned a report from specialists in the field, My Praxis LLP, and they evaluated the situation currently in the city and talked to a lot of our stakeholders, a lot of our businesses, and he came up with 3 key recommendations for how we need to develop. And these are, number 1, that a new strategic coalition is established across the Derbyshire geography, working to promote Derby in the context of the natural assets that we've got around the city. Number 2 was that there was a separate organisation developed to work to strengthen the partnership across Derby so that the tourism offer is seen as being owned and developed by ourselves and our partners in tourism, not just by the City Council. And the third is that a baseline of data and intelligence is created to help inform how we develop the tourism offer, what is successful and where we need to improve. So in bringing the report, what we're asking at this point is that officers are approved to continue to develop and explore those 3 key recommendations so that we can know how best to progress and bring more visitors to the city of Derby.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to ask a question before I bring others in. I can see other options where you do nothing to develop Derby tourism, been downgraded as a Tier 3 DMO with no funding or engagement. That would be a dreadful position for us to be in, I would guess, as a local authority, and one we must try and avoid at all costs. But how do we actually compete? Because all towns and cities up and down this country are struggling because they're dying on their feet. COVID only put booster rockets under the out-of-town shopping and the online shopping. And we see many properties empty in the city. We're doing all that we can locally, and that's irrespective of political considerations, to ensure that we survive and we live to fight another day. But I know that the government professes that it has made some efforts to ensure that cities do survive. Myself and others, certainly in my group, feel that the government isn't doing enough to protect and enhance cities such as Derby, and certainly in the north when we're facing the challenges that we are. And we do need far more help from government, not only in terms of resources, but in terms of a strategy to make sure that this actually happens. And I just wondered what representations you and senior officers are making, both regionally and at government level, to ensure that we are successful and that we do live to fight another day. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I think the way we're working through this is through the National Tourist Board, Visit Britain, and they are working with DCMS to find the best way to help cities to develop, to destinations to develop. So there are lots of campaigns to try and keep people, particularly post-COVID, in the UK by helping people to understand what the variety of offers are. And we have actually just been successful working with our partners, Marketing Peak District in Derbyshire, in getting some campaign funding to the tune of £86,000 to progress the Escape the Everyday campaign in Derby. So where that help and those opportunities are available, we're taking every opportunity to bid for them and benefit from them.
Thank you very much for that. Is there anybody else that wishes to come in? If not, oh, Lucy.
I do sound a little bit like a cracked record here, but I think there's an opportunity for climate-related tourism, and I also think there's an opportunity for sort of industrial-related tourism within Derby, and we need to look outside the expected sorts of normal expectations as to what to offer people. We've got our wonderful silk mill, but wouldn't it be great if people who want to come and see the history of manufacturing and making could also go around and see tours around current manufacturing and current making? And do we have any businesses, for example, within the city who would offer such tours on a regular basis, which people might then pay to do? Obviously, we have the Crown Derby, but we need something not just that's of historic and artistic interest, but on the engineering side as well. Can we explore that sort of thing?
Okay, so Rachel, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I mean, absolutely. This report is positioning ourselves in a place where we recognise the value of the Derby sitting in that context around the Derbyshire, the Peak District, that national asset, but repositioning us as a, I would say, a funky, modern, exciting, vibrant city to come to when you're thinking about coming to Derbyshire for walks in the Peak Districts and pub lunches. You can also come to the city and see things that are happening. You position in that space, recognising we need to work with our partners across our city. So the second recommendation is very much about how we work with all of our stakeholders in that Team Derby approach we've already developed. So with businesses, with our hospitality sector, our cultural partners, to really make that offer as enticing and attractive as possible, really. So, and that absolutely can involve a whole range of other things than just the normal things you want to come and see in a city. Absolutely, it's our ambition. So it's about positioning ourselves in that sort of space and getting ourselves ready for that reaction to whatever they want to decide to do at a national level about how you access some of that funding and the national campaign. So very much those ideas from Councillor Kerr could be part of that local stakeholder conversations.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, right. If there's nobody else, thank you. Item 12, South Derby Growth Zone and Infinity Garden Village. Next steps. Is that...
It's me, Martin.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, this report relates to the highways infrastructure to open up the development land south of Derby for up to 4,500 new homes, and also improve access to Infinity Park and the next phase of Infinity Park. Some of you may be aware that there's also a wider kind of A50 corridor sort of agenda at a sort of Midlands engine level, particularly in relation to things like the Freeport and the sites associated with that. This particular infrastructure relates to a new junction on the A50 and a link road. Estimated cost at the moment is 55.6 million. We found out in the autumn that we had secured, in partnership with Derbyshire County Council, 49.6 million in principle from the Levelling Up Fund, which is obviously good news, but that funding is subject to submitting an appropriate business case. And also, if you do the maths, you'll work out there's a £6 million contribution required from the private sector as well to get us to the 55.6 million total. As the report sets out, this is a project where the lead partner is the County Council, because the majority of this infrastructure is in South Derbyshire, and the housing development is in South Derbyshire as well. But obviously it's being progressed in partnership with South Derbyshire District Council, ourselves, and also the private sector partners. The other things the report covers are the enhanced governance that's now being put in place. Clearly, this award in principle puts us in a very different position to the one where we had a scheme but no funding. And that includes a joint growth board, which members from the City Council will participate in. It also talks about the procurement of the design and build contractor for the actual scheme itself. The other positive thing is we've been given permission by the Department for Transport to draw down part of the Levelling Up Fund award in advance to cover the costs of the scheme development. So the burden of that cost on the local authorities has been, in a sense, transferred to the Levelling Up Fund, which is helpful. The City Council did make a contribution of £100,000 to the initial scheme development costs, but as we sit at the moment, we don't need to make any further contributions to those costs. The recommendations in this report are to support the development of the business case, obviously alongside the County Council and other partners, to support the procurement and delivery of the infrastructure. A key thing is to enter into a collaboration agreement with the other partners, which clearly will set out our respective obligations, and also a recommendation around delegated authority, just to make sure we're able to progress any documentation related to this project. So that's the summary, Chair, of this particular item.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any comments, questions? Lucy?
Say that I'm pleased that the 2 appendices have now been added to the committee papers, though I apologise, I haven't had time to read them since they've appeared. But one of the concerns that I had was regarding the risks. There's clearly the first 2 risks that are identified in the risk section towards the end of the report relate to the risk of the scheme not going ahead. But there are also significant risks of the scheme also going ahead in terms of particularly financial risks, costs overruns. If we don't find the private finances coming in, the time frame, as it points out, is really tight. What happens if we don't deliver within that period? Do we have some clawback of money? If a contractor goes under, that can cause havoc. I recognise that there's been a 24% risk factor built into the overall costs of the building, but there are quite a lot of other risks there, which I think, particularly in the current climate of inflation, which again is a factor that's included there, it would be good to make sure that Cabinet have actually seen and considered all those costs before they make this decision tomorrow, particularly in terms of what split if there are cost overruns. And we've had the experience of the A52 where we know that cost overruns can be significant, and it would be good that we weren't going to be shouldered with too much of that burden, if there is one.
Yeah, would you like to come back in?
Yes, no problem, Chair. Thank you. Yes, I suppose the first point to highlight is clearly as we sit here today, and I recognise we haven't had the scheme fully designed and priced yet by a contractor, but we are potentially in the situation here where this could proceed with effectively no cost directly in capital terms to the local authorities. So all the money coming from Levelling Up and the private sector. So on that starting point, that's obviously an attractive starting point, but recognise there are risks, of course, with any project of this nature. There is, as Councillor Kerr has pointed out, significant contingencies in the estimated cost of including not just contingency but also inflation, a total of around 14 million. But the other thing as well is clearly before we press the go button with the design and build contractor for the highway infrastructure, we would have effectively a cost plan provided by the contractor, so we'd have a sense of where they were heading, and that would ultimately turn into a fixed price contract. So there would be ways of mitigating the risk, but clearly no project of this nature is absolutely risk-free.
Can I ask a question? I mean, you've suggested that all the money is Levelling Up money, which again further indicates to me, and I guess others, that therefore there's little or no risk to the public finances in the city. But wouldn't it be the case that if the Levelling Up money could be used for other projects, isn't any risk for that. And then moving on to the £10 million contingency, is that all levelling up money as well? Thank you.
At the moment, the application that was made to the Levelling Up Fund first round obviously had to be based on a cost plan total, and that was the 55.6 million. So we applied on that basis, and it was the highest award, albeit it's in principle and subject to that business case. It's the highest award nationally through the Levelling Up Fund. So in a sense, we're sort of locked into that particular use of the money, but obviously the business plan will have to build up around securing the actual funding. So the funding is in principle until we've agreed with DFT the business plan. But I have to say the signals are very positive when DFT are already saying we can draw down 3.4 million of the funding to help us with the scheme costs.
Yeah, I think I do share, I'm sure a lot of people share as well, I'll bring Alison in a second, Lucy's concerned, because we've always scarred by the debacle over the A52, and we're just wanting to make sure that there's no repeat of that, because whether it's central government money or local money, we just need to make sure those lessons are learnt and that we don't have a repeat of that. I'll take Alison, then okay. Rachel's waving at me or wanting to come in. Rachel, not Rachel, Alison first then.
Yes, thank you very much. I suppose I recognise the work that David has put into this scheme, and I acknowledge that and respect that. I do think it's a bit sad, though, for Derby, that our levelling up funding is a road junction. I mean, unless, I've clearly misunderstood the idea of levelling up, but of the concept of the words. I feel confident, David, that you are going to get this money, or at least I hope, unless everything you believe on Facebook can't be believed. I suppose that is intrinsically true, because I keep getting posts from HM government on Facebook telling me that £50 million of levelling up money has already been allocated to Derby at this particular moment in time, which is interesting, and I wonder why I'm receiving those Facebook posts as a resident in the city. But whilst I recognise all the work that's gone into this, is there any scope for a further application to this fund, and is there a category for social use within the fund criteria, such that we might apply for some further funding perhaps to do that might have some relevance to some kind of levelling up in our society? Thank you.
Yeah, can I just come in before we bring you back in? I suppose it begs the question, which Alison says tongue-in-cheek, there's a serious point there. When there's an announcement, not an announcement, when it's been announced on Facebook. I mean, I think there is a point there which I think is fairly valid. So,
Chair, may I say it's also...
Oh, and then I think Rachel wants to come in.
It's also on hoardings on Osmaston Road.
I mean, there are also electronic posters in Derby, and there are adverts on the radio also about that levelling up fund allocation, and I can't possibly comment on the government's intention around that, but yeah, I've seen them as well. I was going to make the point around A52 really, and just to reassure committee and members that extensive briefing and learning has been made from that project. There are some great things about that project and some things that need to be learnt from and things that didn't work particularly well, and there's been really extensive work to understand all the implications of the project and to learn those lessons. And I would just reinforce those officers that report has gone through our Audit and Governance Committee. It is being used internally by officers in any project that comes up that has relevance, so it is being used. We are learning those lessons, so I can give you reassurance about that, and there is no risk about repeating any of those mistakes in this project.
Thank you for that reassurance, Rachel. David, is there any more that you wish to add?
Yeah, I suppose a couple of points. The first thing is, because this is subject to the business case, if you like, in the official world within DFT, it is still subject to that. However, this project now forms part of DFT's capital programme, so that the money has been allocated. It's just that we're obviously not in a position to draw down beyond the scheme development costs until we've actually got the business case approved. The other question, I think, was around levelling up generally. I'm not going to get into a debate now about what the government's definition of levelling up, because levelling up is a term that's widely used now. But what I would say is the round 2 of levelling up has just been announced, levelling up fund, and that has the same primary themes as round 1, which was culture, regeneration and transport. And to a certain extent, I would argue, and we don't really need to apologise for this as an authority, is, you know, the scheme is there to apply to, and we have to put schemes forward which fit the themes that the government is prioritising. So I think this is a success of the County Council working with ourselves and others in securing the largest award in the country. So I think there is obviously a lot of work to do to get this scheme delivered within the timeframes required, but that's why the governance and the procurement, etc., obviously is critical in terms of getting a contractor on board ASAP, so we can get not just the scheme development progress, but also start to fix the price as well.
Thank you very much, David. Alison.
I have a recommendation then, Chair, if I may.
Okay.
I don't have a PC, Stephen. So off the top of my head, executive scrutiny recognises the council's success in obtaining £50 million from the current round of levelling up funding for the A50 works. Executive scrutiny recommends that the council submit an application in the next round of levelling up funding. The council submits an application in the category of culture. Thank you.
Okay. Before I take seconds and go to the vote, I'll take comments first. Okay.
Actually, just had a quick question, Chair, if that's okay. Just before
Sure. Okay.
Just looking on the report and talking about the purchasing of the land, and it references that we've got good relationships with the landowners, but there's negotiations ongoing, may result in compulsory purchase of the land. In the budget, the land budget is £2.5 million, if I've got that correct. So if we end up having to compulsory purchase, are we basically saying there's £2.5 million to compulsory purchase that land? Because with negotiations ongoing, is that not basically saying to the landowners how much is there if we need to compulsory purchase it? Does that not then come into the negotiations and make things more difficult, if you see where I'm coming from?
No, I get exactly what you're saying. I obviously, within the, I suppose this is being in the transparency of local government, is when we bid for that funding, we had to be clear what the breakdown was of the costs that we were suggesting. I think this is not a kind of a fundamental answer to the question, but the majority of that land assembly is actually within the area beyond the City Council's boundary. We're sort of the proportion, if you like, that's within the City Council's area will be quite small. I mean, the whole infrastructure and everything is predominantly in South Derbyshire, but obviously benefits the city and Infinity Park in particular.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Okay, in terms of Councillor Martin's recommendation, I'll second that. Lucy.
Chair, can I, because as there are many other aspects of transport which might also be needing investment, as well as culture, and I can't remember what the third category was. Regeneration, which would also benefit us. I think it'd be good to hear and to give Cabinet reasoning why it should be culture in this instance and not regeneration or other aspects of transport.
Alison?
I think that's a fair question, Councillor Kerr. And the reason I think it should be culture is bearing it because we have just submitted a bid to be the City of Culture, which failed. However, that momentum has now been put in place. The category of culture, I assume, can be, as with many of these categories, applied quite broadly. So, culture can mean projects to help mental health people with mental health problems. It can be children who don't get out, who never get to see a film at the cinema or theatre. So, helping young people widen their horizons and inspire them. In sort of extracurricular activities, etc. All those kinds of things. So I'm not really, how it would be articulated would obviously depend on the actual bid at the time. I fully understand the points you're making about regeneration and transport, but they have been strong foci of the council in recent years, and going forward, culture has already been articulated as the key theme for trying to regenerate the city, for trying to, I believe, to inspire our young people to do better in school than they're currently doing. As you know, our results are still in the bottom 10% of the country. So it's for those kinds of reasons that I'm saying that we recommend that it's culture. I have to say, Lucy, that you might think, well, let's have another 50 million for a kind of light rail system thing. It won't buy us a light rail system. So if we could have several hundred million for a light rail system, that's great. But we both know that if it goes to transport again, it's likely to be another road scheme, which are valuable, but we need to rebalance the emphasis in our city, I believe. Thank you.
Yeah, before I bring Alan in, the reason that I'm recommending Alison's recommendation, I'm seconding it, is because culture could encapsulate regeneration, jobs, the city centre revival, all these things that are desperate. We talked about it earlier. And this city centre, like many, are dying. Yet with culture and regeneration, that could play a major driver. I've got to admit, okay, you understand about, at the face of it, this multi-million-pound junction. It isn't that inspiring. It's probably important, and I'm not knocking that at all. But sometimes we need to get that balance. And I think this recommendation captures that balance, and that's why I'm supporting it. No, Lisa, I'm bringing Alan back in. I'll come back to you in a second, Lisa, because you've had many shots so far.
Thank you, Chair. I agree totally with Councillor Martin. Culture, in my mind, drives any city. And we've pulled the trigger on the City of Culture bid for the future. We didn't get it this time, and we were very late going in, but to get where we did get at a very late stage, I think is a tremendous pat on the back for everybody concerned with the bid for the City of Culture. So I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Lucy, and then I'm going to take it to vote.
Chair, I was thinking that as Alison sort of described, what we're looking for is activity in particular areas. Without, culture could be absolutely anything, and we're going to be spending millions on Beckettwell, for example, which is similar quantity of money, effectively, as we've got coming in here. So we are getting spending on culture, but the sort of culture that Alison's referred to is culture that will benefit young people or disadvantaged communities. And if those are the outcomes that we're looking for, then shouldn't that be what we're asking for? Rather than spending this on culture, we should be spending this on something that will benefit specifically young people and disadvantaged communities.
I understand why.
Without being specific about what it is that we're doing, because that might come into the regeneration angle rather than the culture angle.
Thank you for your explanation why you might not be able to support it, or you might abstain, but I'm going to put it to the vote, and I'm certainly going to support it because it can be as wide as we want it to be, but it's got to encapsulate, I think, from Alison's point of view, mine and Alan's, and I think other councillors as well, and the public, that aspect of culture and regeneration. And I'm sure we can do that. Alison's nodding, and both Alison and Alan.
Could you just reread the recommendation again, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Alison, do you want to...
I'm relying on... Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. So the Executive Scrutiny Board recognises the Council's success in obtaining £50 million from the Levelling Up Fund for the A50 works and recommends to Council Cabinet that in the next round the Council submits an application in the category of culture. I think that's covered that, Chair.
All those in favour, please indicate. All those against? Okay. Thank you very much.
All in favour, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, moving on. Item 17. I will now launch this one. Riverboat proposals for the River Derwent.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
So from one transport route to another. So this report relates to a vision, a proposal, which obviously has been in the making for some time now, and really very much the first step in achieving a wider vision of bringing the River Derwent back into use and contributing to the vibrancy of the city centre. If you go back to the city centre master plan that was published in 2016, you know, that very much advocated, strengthening the links between the city centre and the river, and this is a project which will help us along that journey, so to speak. And the City Council has supported, going back to 2018, the Derby and Sandiacre Canal Trust in acquiring the boat, which used D2N2 LEP funding. And then what this report is effectively doing is formalising the expenditure that's been deployed to date, and also that required to ensure the appropriate supporting infrastructure is in place, because one of the critical issue here is that when launched, you know, this is a safe operation for the public to use, and hence the need for the licensing regime that's being introduced. And we've also sought independent technical advice to ensure that that all the recommendations that have been put to us are implemented, both from a city council and from the trust perspective. The other thing as well, which might not seem that significant, but I think it is giving this project more status in terms of it being adopted within the wider project governance for Derby Riverside, within the regeneration function. And within the report, we set out the costs incurred to date, which is £185,000. Of that £185,000, about half of that, £95,000, is from non-Derby City Council sources, and that's the LEP and additional restrictions grant. And then we're setting out the anticipated additional costs required, both capital and revenue, to get to the point where the riverboat service can actually commence, ideally later this year. All of the costs going forward are intended to be managed within existing budgets, including an ongoing revenue commitment around maintenance of the river itself, which clearly will have wider benefits beyond just this particular proposal. So the recommendations within the report are to approve the progressing of the project in the aligned with the costs that we've set out in the report, to update the capital programme through a delegated approval, and also to approve the City Council entering into a licence agreement with the Canal Trust, both in relation to mooring of the boat and actually use of the river as well. Obviously, that's subject to the Trust making an application for that licence, and also a delegated authority for the Strategic Director of Corporate Resources to submit funding bids and secure grant support as and when such opportunities arise, if there's a way of, again, utilising other than City Council funding sources. So that is the report, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Before I bring people in, let me say that I guess most councillors are totally supportive of the Trust and its aims, but we must get this right, not only for the Trust, but for the people of Derby and this council. And I guess some of the questions that may come out of the contributions may encapsulate that. And I certainly have got a recommendation along those lines as well. Anybody who'd like to come in at this stage? Lucy? Okay, thank you.
I'll just say I think this is really exciting, and I think it's. I really hope it works well and goes ahead effectively. I think that we need to think of the Derwent as already navigable. There are people who regularly row up and down from the rowing club, so to talk about it not being navigable, I think, is a bit disingenuous to the river. But I do think that on paragraph 2.4, we need to be a bit more specific about what is being proposed, in that this recommendation doesn't relate it back to this project. And I think it needs to be, it just refers to other funding bids and into other funding agreements, but it needs to be related to this specific project. And I hope that that can be done by officers before tomorrow night's meeting, or make an appropriate recommendation on that. Otherwise, I was just wondering, in terms of the funding, given that this project has been ongoing for a good few, years really, I think it's a pity that it's come now as being a variation to the transport budget, which was only approved, I think, last month, capital for transport, and I think that's pretty poor timing, really. I also wondered whether there was any Section 106 agreement money that might be utilised either on transport or on public realm or public open space, parks, which all might come into this category, and it might be a source of funding that sometimes I know our Section 106 funding is forgotten and isn't utilised, and I think we should be looking there for some of this funding.
Yeah, just the second point that I had, I mean, obviously, a number of years ago, I remember when we had a boat on the River Derwent. I think it was a guy that ran it from Belper, and again, a bit like the A52, it's making sure that we learn the lessons from that. What was good about that? What's different with regard to this scheme? What worked then? What didn't work then? And hopefully, throughout this process, those lessons have been learnt. And if there are any more further lessons to be learned as we go along, that actually will be. So it's those reassurances. Alison, you want to come in? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Like everybody else, I support the work of the Trust. However, I do have specific questions in relation to this report, particularly around the funding, because it is very important that when we're talking about this level of money, excuse my phone there, that we get it right, as Councillor Repton says, and that the scheme is viable for the future. I think that it seems that £183,000 has already been spent, and yet I believe that the amount the council previously said it was going to spend was £78,000. So how's that happened? And then I'd also I think the sums here are quite significant, really, in terms of the kind of money the council has to invest. So I'd like to know, what's the business case for this, and how viable is it in terms of the income it can generate, and what's the payback for the council, that sort of area, and also have the trust, or has anybody applied for a licence yet? Thank you.
Yes, so I think that the questions there to encapsulate we've got 186,000. Request for another 183,000, and then there's £40,000 a year revenue cost. So I think that's what Councillor Martin was referring to. Do you want to respond, David?
I will attempt to, because there's quite a lot of questions there. I think, first of all, just going back to Councillor Kerr's points, the other users, certainly, there's been dialogue with them, like the rowing clubs, etc., because partly from a safety perspective, one of the recommendations from one of the key things I was particularly keen on, and Philip has been managing this relationship, is seeking independent, technically qualified advice on this. So someone who has no interest in Derby per se, but actually was qualified to tell us what needed to be in place to make sure this was safe. One of those items was regular engagement with other users of the river and making sure the the route that the boat takes is clearly understood, and also the times that the boat will operate, so it's compatible with those other users. So there's already been dialogue around that. I take on the point about 2.4. We can probably make that more specific. I think just going back to, I think, Chair, some of your points about lessons learned, I think one of the things this time is we are professionalising this because we have to, in terms of the licensing arrangements, not just in terms of the boat, but also in terms of the people who are going to operate the boat and ensuring they're suitably medically fit, qualified, etc., etc. The one thing I would say is that in terms of I think the term viability was mentioned. The understanding between ourselves and the Trust has always been that whilst the City Council would help with some of the capital costs associated with infrastructure, etc., we will not get involved in the kind of the operating cost side of things. This is once the infrastructure is in place, then the boat's there. It's for the Trust to operate it, and we will not get involved in, if you like, the day-to-day operating cost part of the equation. In terms of the costs that have been incurred to date, basically what you have is the actual costs that have been incurred to date include our contribution to the riverboat, which was a total of about 81,000. The costs associated with the launch back in October, which was 17,000. The survey of the riverbed, which was one of the recommendations from the independent consultant, was about 20,000, and that independent technical advice was about £7,000. That comes to a total of £125,000 or thereabouts, and then you've got staff costs on top of that, which gets you to your 185,000. Now, of that 185,000, 95,000 was from Derby City Council sources. So 78,000 was from Local Growth Fund, which was the LEP, and 17,000 was from the Additional Restrictions Grant. So as I say, there was a significant proportion, about 50% of those costs were actually covered from non-Derby City Council sources. In terms of the costs going forward, that obviously primarily relates to the infrastructure, the landing platform, the mooring point, etc., etc. And obviously there's some staff costs in there, but also a 40% contingency. So the cost may end up being less than is actually portrayed there in terms of the totals. The one thing, I suppose, I tried to say this right at the beginning, is I think we recognise that this is an endeavour, if you like, collectively between the Trust and the Council, which when we set out to try and achieve this, we probably didn't know what the total costs were going to be. I mean, I think that's the reality. What we're now trying to do through this report is recognise more transparently what the costs are that have been incurred to date and what those costs we anticipate to be, to get us to a point where the riverboat service can commence, which I think we all, I think, accept is a good thing. But that operation has to be safe, and that has to be the number one priority. So recognise that there's an element of tidying up, in a sense, in this report, of formalising the position to date and making sure the governance is in place. But we have, as I've just stated, we have utilised wherever possible, non-Derby City Council sources, obviously, to keep the project moving.
Chair, could I...
Thank you, David. Alison.
Just the licensing. Well, thank you, David. I mean, I am not reassured as a city councillor that the project was embarked upon without a grasp, even a ballpark grasp, even of the cost of the project at the outset. So I'd just like to recognise I don't think that's good practice, and it seems a little odd to me, to be honest. But I also asked about the licence because according to current licensing policy, can the Trust apply for a licence? Are they going to apply to a licence? What's the situation about that? Thank you.
The reality is the Trust has to apply and secure a licence, both for the boat and for the people who will operate the boat before they can operate this service. They cannot operate the service until they have those licences in place. That's a black and white issue. It's not a negotiation.
So have they applied for? Has one been applied for? Apologies, Chair.
Not yet, no.
Okay, you've got your answer. Right.
Well, I think there is a point I'm driving at here, which I suspect David anticipates me to say. So I apologise, Chair. You're right. That was irritating to come in like that. It's just that if we don't know that a licence is going to be issued, then how can we agree to this spend? Thank you.
We understand it is the intention of the trust to apply for a licence both for the boat and for the people to operate the boat, but I'm just telling you now that they haven't applied yet, that's all.
What I'll do, I'll go with my recommendation, which I think will cover this, and hopefully members will across parties support it, because I think it's perhaps the best way forward to reassure these concerns. And that's Cabinet ensures that all planning requirements are approved and all licences are issued before further expenditure in order to protect the Council, the Trust and the public. And I think that's a reasonable way forward. Do I have a seconder for that at all? Okay. Sorry? Yep.
I just point out from a governance point of view that the licensing committee is a responsible body to issue licences, and the executive secretary has no authority or cabinet to instruct anyone other than the licensing committee to do that.
Yeah, I still, I don't quite understand that, but I still think from this board's point of view that I think it's beholden on us to make that recommendation to Cabinet to look at these issues, because these are large amounts of public money. Concerns have been raised. The issue of licensing has been raised as well. Lucy. Yes. Cabinet ensures that all planning requirements are approved and all licences are issued before further expenditure in order to protect the Council, the Trust and the public. I've got a seconder for Alison.
Just in support of my recommendation and in response to Rachel's point, but obviously, Rachel, I'm not pretend. The way I interpret the words there is not to say that the Cabinet can ensure that licensing provides a licence, but it's to ensure that a licence is applied for and is in place before the funding is agreed. So I think that's why I'm supporting it. Thank you.
It's putting the cart before the boat.
Chair, is it not that the funding is agreed, but the funding is spent?
I think I'm quite happy with the recommendation to be applied by Cabinet as they wish, as long as they agree to the principle of it. So those in favour of the recommendation, please show. Those against, please show.
That was 4 there, I think, Chair, in favour.
Thank you very much for that. Item 14, writing off uncollectible sundry debts and housing benefit overpayments. Who's Alison? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This report is in relation, as you say, in terms of writing off uncontrollable sundry debts and housing benefit overpayments. The current financial regulations state that anything over £10,000 needs to come to Cabinet for approval for write-offs. There are situations where we do have reasons for debts that aren't collected, which are detailed in the report. Sometimes debtors die, sometimes businesses go into insolvency or liquidation, or there's abscondence. There is a pink paper attached to this report in the confidential item of this meeting, which details the individual cases in relation to the debts included within this report. It's all right.
Can the officers please disappear quietly and let Alison deliver speech? Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Now, I was saying there are situations where we cannot collect debt. We do raise a significant amount of sundry debt and housing benefit over the course of a year, in terms of £70 million worth of sundry debt and £1.5 million worth of housing benefit overpayments. There are significant income streams to the council. There are situations where we can't collect that debt, predominantly where the debtor may die, or where we've got insolvency or liquidation proceedings against our debtors, or that the debtor absconds. There is a confidential paper attached to this agenda, and the details of the individual cases are contained within that confidential paper.
Thank you very much, Alison. Any comments or observations on this particular paper? If not, thank you very much for that. I'm moving on to it says item XX, but it's meant to be item, in my old school would be XV, 15, isn't it? It should be XV, if my Roman numerals are correct. Is that right? You're the figures person, Alison, yeah. So XV rather than XX. Alison, over to you.
Thank you. This is the regular monthly report in terms of compliance with contract and financial procedure rules. There are numerous items, so I'll just take you through one by one in terms of the items and recommendations contained within the report. The first one is in relation to the Amari Park Traveller site and an addition to the capital programme for 22-23. This is in relation to some proposed capital works at that particular site, of which there's funding identified within the revenue budget for this financial year and next financial year. So there's a proposal there to carry forward the allocations and to approve a revenue contribution to the spend of that capital scheme. It is £70,000 and there's a recommendation in there to approve the addition of the £70,000 to the 2022-23 capital programme. The second item on this report is in relation to some significant funding that's been awarded to our public health service for substance misuse funding. And we do have a universal drug treatment grant of up to circa 5 million for the next 3 financial years. The new drug strategy from Harm to Hope states that this funding will be extended by a minimum of 3 years to March 2025, although we don't have the confirmation of the actual amounts that will be allocated to the public health service. As I said, it's been anticipated that these will be estimated up to £5 million for the next 3 years, and it's recommended within the report to approve the authority to the Strategic Director of People Services, in consultation with the Strategic Director of Corporate Resources and relevant Cabinet members, to enter into all necessary contracts and agreements associated with this additional public health ring-fence substance misuse funding. The third item on the report is in relation to additional funding that's been received in terms of domestic abuse safe accommodation. The Domestic Abuse Act 2021 placed new duties on local authorities across England to ensure that survivors of domestic abuse and their children can access the right support in safe accommodation. So 125 million nationally for new burdens funding has been allocated to local authorities in this financial year 22-23. Derby City Council has been confirmed a grant determination of £603,000 in relation to this particular area. The recommendations in the report are to accept the funding of £603,000 and to commission support to survivors of domestic abuse and their children in safe accommodation to meet the administrative new burdens of the cost delivering those functions. It's also recommended in the report to approve delegated authority to the Strategic Directors of People Services in consultation with the relevant members to authorise entering into contracts for the provision of services to the survivors of domestic abuse and their children in safe accommodation. The next item on the report is in relation to the Future Transport Zone Programme, £90 million funded scheme from the Department of Transport to trial new transport innovations within Derby, within nationally. Derby City and Nottingham City Council were awarded 16.7 million of the overall pot of funding for trialling those new innovations. And as a result of a report presented to Nottingham City Council Cabinet Board in January of this year, it was approved to pass Derby City Council a sum of £4.2 million for funding for the designated FTZ projects associated with the electric mobility hubs, and approval is being sought to accept that funding from Nottingham City Council. There's also on this report a carry forward request of £50,000. So this is a carry forward request from the last financial year, 2021-22 22 into 2022-23, a £50,000, which was an allocated budget that hadn't been deployed, and the proposal is to use that for the development of the devolution business case that was outlined in Cabinet in March 2022. So there's a recommendation to carry forward £50,000 unspent revenue budgets into this financial year to deploy for that activity. And penultimately on the report is the High Needs Transformation Programme. At the meeting in November last year, Council Cabinet approved the use of some of the top slice of the dedicated schools grant to complete the High Needs Transformation Programme in relation to SEND transformation. And within that approval, there was an award of a contract of up to £640,000 to Empower, which is a external consultancy consultancy company that are specialised in the SEND transformation area and have a good track record with work with other local authorities. There was also a balance of the funding, the £930,000 funding that was to be used for internal capacity, which was to bolster up that use of external consultants. However, as we're progressing through the transformation programme, we have been unable to recruit to the programme posts that we anticipated we would do. So there's a requirement now to shift the balance between external support and internal support from the overall funding envelope. There'll be no change from the overall funding envelope. The programme will still commit to using £930,000. However, it may be necessary for us to award to Empower an additional contract of up to £290,000 from that allocation, that original allocation, to support the lack of the internal infrastructure on that transformation programme. The last part of the report is in relation to the Household Support Fund. In the spring budget announced at the end of March 22, the Chancellor of the Exchequer confirmed that the Household Support Fund will be made available from April of this year, and that scheme builds on the scheme that we've had in existence for the winter of 21-22, although that scheme comes to end in March 2022. The previous scheme has been a success in terms that was £2.2 million worth of funding to the City Council, of which we have successfully managed to provide vouchers for food during school holidays over the winter, and have also made 6,989 awards to financially support families and individuals in Derby over that time, and that attributed to an additional £1.4 million worth of spend. The new grant, however, has been, although we haven't received our allocations, we do think that our grant will mirror what the previous grant was, so circa 2.24 million. Although the guidance for the new grant this financial year has had a subtle change. The new grant explains that awards must be made on the framework of at least 1/3 of the total funding to support households with children. At least 1/3 of the funding will be ring-fenced to support pensioners, which is a new category, and up to 1/3 of the total funding to other households generally in need of support. It is recommended to approve the acceptance of the 22-23 award for the Household Support Grant, which is circa 2.224 million, and to approve the delegation of the final details of the scheme to the Strategic Director of People Services and the Cabinet Member for Children and Young People. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Any comments, questions at all? Lucy.
Thank you. I'll go with the two easy questions first, and then come back to the last one, which people might want to talk about. The first one is, what is an electric mobility hub? Do we know? The second question is regarding the household support grant. I think last time it was appropriate for it to be the Cabinet for children, CYP, not adults, but this time with the adult older people's grants, I think that should be jointly between the Cabinet Member for children and for adults on that, and I think that's probably a recommendation that you might be able to take forward as officers. Do you want to think about electric mobility?
Yes, so my understanding, and I don't pretend to be an expert on these things, but this is about how we can create a space that is both a charging space for charging electric vehicles, but also a mobility hub where you can get different vehicles to move around the city. So that may be where you can get a scooter, or you can get a bus from, or a rapid transit system, or whatever it would be, a place where travel options are accessible.
Chair, that's really interesting, because one of the comments that I've had put to me recently is that we need to do something to make it easier. It's always been a problem to get from the bottom of St Peter Street to the top of St Peter Street. And you know, if it was possible to have a mobility scooter hub at the bottom, which would take people to the top, and somebody else to fetch the scooters back again, and I'm thinking probably these are disabled scooters or something equivalent, then that would be really useful. I don't know if that can be included within that sort of scheme, but if not...
It could be mayhem. I can see, you know, sort of like Ninja Turtle mobility scooters fighting each other on there.
We can have
I just shudder.
We can have some intelligent self-driving them coming back again or something. I don't know.
Ski lift.
Yes, continuous circulation.
I was joking.
No, I'm not sure.
Sorry.
I'm not sure that will work.
Okay.
The question that I had, the bigger question to talk about, is the devolution business case, which introduces a further tier of local government in a way that is clearly needs a business case writing for it, because it isn't obvious to us that there is one solution that is better than the others. We've come down with one, other local authorities have come down with others. There is discussion about it, and I really don't know whether, you know, we could spend £50,000 putting together a business case for one thing or for a different thing, or challenge the government that it's got it completely wrong. And I just really don't know whether this is the right thing to be doing at all.
Thank you, Lucy. Who wants to respond to that? Alison? Or?
In terms of the devolution of the business case, or, I mean... yeah.
I mean, these things are really difficult, aren't they? There's not a simple answer or a black and white, you know, review. I think what we are doing or trying to do is recognise the way that we are a unitary state. The government has all the power, and, you know, we have to bid and ask for flexibility and freedoms to do things at a local level. What the government has determined is that a devolution arrangement, where it would bring some of those powers down to the level of a combined authority with a mayor, is the way the government is structuring some of those decision making and some of those powers. And so what we are exploring as a set of 4 local authorities in the upper tier in the D2N2 footprint is that this may be really valuable to us, because we would therefore get some power, some funding, some flexibility. We could then determine at a local level. Whether we agree with that process or not is really a different conversation, but it's the way the government has designed it, and we are, you know, on that journey to try and find if we can do that for our area.
I think I can understand that. We might not like the rules, but they are what they are, and we have to try and operate within them. So I understand the frustration there.
It's the balance that, do we spend £50,000 writing more reports for something that we're having to try and persuade the government that it does or does not want to give us? Whereas we question whether we ought to be spending a similar amount of money on giving us something that will give people excitement travelling up and down the Derwent. You know, it's one can be seen money down the drain, and the other is, but which is which?
I mean, there is, again,
Rachel.
no answer to that, but I think if you look at the combined authorities that exist in the country as it is now, in the West Midlands particularly, South Yorkshire, other parts of the country, the level of capital funding they've had from government puts levelling up funding, you know, in pale insignificance, to be honest. You know, hundreds of millions of pounds of funding to support infrastructure, regeneration projects, a range of things. That surprise this £50,000 might unlock. So, and again, you know, from what we are on the early foothills of the conversation with government, it does seem very positive.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Alison. Item 16 is exclusion of the press and public. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. Just need to do my... If we're all in agreement with that, Chair, I'll give you the...
We're all in agreement, are we? Yes.
Thank you.
Nodding
Let me just end the
enthusiastically.
broadcast. Thank you.